shown images of homeless people had similar brain stimulation as a control group that was shown images of vomit and overflowing toilets. And then we have Wolf and Stuber, who actually, when they were surveying a town where a state mental hospital is located in the United States, found that they saw mentally ill people as either homeless or psychotic killers. Those were the two main perceptions that they had. But it still didn't explain to me why, when I was watching How I Met Your Mother, I came across Milt. And Milt is this homeless character in season 4, who you can see him there listening to a grapefruit. I guess they could find an apple on short notice. You'll get that one later. He's played by Dan Castellaneta. Dan Castellaneta grew up in the Chicago suburbs, came right out of high school, went to university, and wanted to study to become an art teacher, although he was lucky enough to become a voice actor. And just a year before this episode actually came out, he renegotiated his contract with Fox in order to be paid $400,000 US per episode of The Simpsons, where he voices Homer. Which got me thinking about this guy. I don't know if any of you actually recognize him like that. I'll give you a bit of a hint. That's actually Charlie Chaplin. This is him in The Gold Rush from 1925. Now, he played a famous character called Tramp, who was a wandering homeless traveler, but he was noble. He helped people, especially in 1950s self-titled The Tramp, where he actually helped a farm fend off a wave of burglars. So how do we get from noble to nuts? That is, how do we get from this portrayal of a character who is flawed? He's flawed. He's a human being, but he's a good person. He tries to do good things, to this very warped and exaggerated portrayal of mental illness. And so I had 3 questions, and I had 3 hypotheses that I wanted to posit. I thought, when did they become associated, mental illness and homelessness? I thought it would be probably between 1960 and 1980. Why they became associated, I think it has something to do with the socioeconomic and cultural shifts that happened between that period. And I wanted to figure out if there were any sort of negative effects associated with this sort of unholy matrimony of these two kind of downtrodden minority groups. So I started to look at how I could study that, and I realized that the media does a really good job of kind of framing how people like to look at things. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the movie Doctor Strange, but it became under a lot of controversy in 2016 because they cast Tilda Swinton, who's a white British actress, in a role that in the comic books was actually a Tibetan man. And one of the screenwriters actually said in the New York Times article that the reason they did that is because they didn't want to lose money in the Chinese market. Because if you state that Tibet is a place, you risk alienating 1 billion people. So I figured if they were willing to do that for a big budget movie, why wouldn't they be willing to do that for portrayals of homeless people that better reflects and kind of appeal to people's own perceptions? So I started looking at literature, film, and television, looking at different portrayals and characterizations of the homeless people throughout from 1900s to about today, and then kind of before and after 1970s to try and compare the differences between the two portrayals. So just in case no one knew this, the reason I really stuck with me during childhood, where this is where you start seeing that more traditional view of a homeless person being more stationary, living on the street, trying to sell things. But there's a switch after 1970 where there's less of a portrayal of just people wandering, being homeless, and now all of a sudden there's a bit more of a innate character flaw in each of them. Like especially Ironweed, the main character is actually now an alcoholic vagrant. iCarly actually did a really interesting thing where yes, I watched iCarly, this is how dedicated I am to my research. They actually started calling all homeless people hobos, but the specific versions of homeless people that they show are actually very uncomfortable to be around. And I'll get into that in a bit. And then I, of course, go back to How I Met Your Mother with Milt. So I wanted to compare Chaplin to the Tramp with Milt. Specifically, Chaplin is a wandering traveler who encounters a problem, which then leads him to be involved in a bunch of comedic situations. Now this is different from Milt, who is the stationary homeless man, who is the problem to the main character in the episode. He actually has something the main character needs. And it's actually his exaggerated mental state that is the comedic situation. And if we look at Lenny and George and Francis Phelan, who's the main character of William Kennedy's Ironweed, Lenny and George, they both take place during the Great Depression, but Lenny and George are victimized. They are victims of economic circumstance. They are, Lenny is falsely accused of rape in the last town they were in, so they had to leave. But they're portrayed as productive members of society. They have a fantasy about owning their own farm. They work hard. They try their best. Versus Francis Phelan, who actually killed his infant son by dropping him, and he may have actually been drunk when he did it. It's never explicitly stated in the novel. And he leaves his family. He leaves and abandons his family to become an alcoholic vagrant for 22 years, and just basically leaves. So it's portrayed more as his choice than as being a victim of circumstance. Now, if we compare the Tramp to the hobos from iCarly, the Tramp actually helps people. He helps them try and overcome their issues. And again, he is the one that encounters comedic situations. The hobos in iCarly harass people. They inappropriately touch people. In one episode, they're fondling Carly's hair, and they want to sleep in the bathtub in her hotel room. Or they spill chili on one of the main characters and then try and eat it without a spoon. They are making the characters uncomfortable, and it's this discomfort that creates the comedy that is portrayed in the show. But the most interesting thing I noticed is that before 1970, almost all of the examples that I found are from the perspective of someone who's actually experienced either poverty or firsthand of the minority group of homelessness. So The Road is actually not a biographical account, like I mentioned. Chaplin actually, he was sent to a workhouse twice before the age of 9. His mom was actually committed to an insane asylum when he was 14, and he had to live with his father, who was an alcoholic. Steinbeck actually worked on a farm during the summer in California with migrant workers, and he experienced the harsher side of the migrant life, and also the darker side of human nature, which gave him the material to write Mice and Men. And On the Road is actually what's called romantic left, which is a real thing that happened that's given fictitious names. So Jack Kerouac actually was South Paradise, and his best friend Neil Cassidy was actually Dean Moriarty in the story, was the one that he traveled with. Post 1970, you see Dan Castellaneta, who was more economically, residentially and psychologically privileged, I like to say. So he grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. He was able to go to school. He was able to find a job, and he then went on to portray this, I would say, offensive character in the show. So I wanted to kind of understand what happened in 1970, and I think one of the things that may have led to this is deinstitutionalization. So from 1960 to 1990, there was a sharp decrease in the amount of beds that were available in psychiatric care hospitals in state and U.S. county. It dropped from 563,000 to 98,800, right? That's a sharp decrease in 30 years, right? Which led to, the reason they did this is because there were a bunch of economic changes. People were more liberal. They believed that because the medications started coming out, and because they had Medicare and Medicaid, that they could support these people, but they didn't realize that these people who were poor, who actually thus there was this large amount of people who didn't have supervision or care that ended up in urban areas on the street. And the other thing that happened was injuries. Here you see Ken Westerfield's weapon of choice, the Frisbee. He's actually the one who popularized organized Frisbee sports. But there was this larger amount in the 1970s of movement. A lot of hippies were able to hitchhike, they time flight, they went wherever wherever the fun was. There were a lot of books that came out in that period about how to convert trucks, vans, and buses into mobile homes. But there was this sharp decrease leading up to the 1980s, this rise of conservatism in the Christian right that actually led to the election of Ronald Reagan in 1981 in the United States. And so I think because of that, there was this less approval of this vagrant lifestyle, so homeless people started to be portrayed more as stationary. They didn't move around as much because that wasn't as common. But I can't say for sure whether this is the cause. I can only notice that this happened, and then all of a sudden there's this huge shift in how people are portrayed. And I wanted to look at negative effects. And so I have this video that hopefully will work. I just want to show you a bit of it. Okay, well, it's not going to work. I thought I worked the kinks in this time.
We should always go online. Oh. Can you just go on the internet?
Internet? Okay. We got fantastic. Just while I'm doing this, does everyone know who the Fine Brothers are? Everyone's heard of the Fine Brothers? Anyone who hasn't, please raise their hands. Okay, the Fine Brothers are a group on YouTube, two brothers, and they show videos, video games, other things to different kind of, I guess you'd call them focus groups, like kids or elderly people, just to kind of see their reaction to certain things. And I noticed that there was this one video.
I'm surprised this homeless was
You
really.
don't get to see the whole thing, but essentially they saw the video of the Golden Voice homeless man, which was a huge thing in like 2011, which is when this video came out. But notice the kid's reaction to homelessness. When it comes in the
Cool
question.
radio voice. What friendly guy on a box?
What does being homeless mean?
You gotta live on the streets.
You don't have a home. You're less of a home.
Basically, no food. You kind of just steal your food.
What do you think about homeless people?
I feel sorry for them. Sometimes they like mutter to themselves, and it really freaks me out. Like people make fun of them all the time on like iCarly and stuff. Like, ooh, hobo.
They say hobo on iCarly?
Yeah, a lot.
Everybody has been saying hobo.
A hobo? That guy was a hobo?
It was a hobo.
You're influenced by iCarly too much. How do people become homeless?
You buy so much stuff and everything, then you get bankrupt, then you lose your house, drugs, getting high all the time.
I don't really get into politics considering that I'm 10.
They used to be in this like mental hospital and then closed down and then they just threw them on the streets.
This video is.
The last girl is a bit blunt. She's not entirely incorrect with the way that deinstitutionalization was happening, but you really see there is this very distinct view in children on what homeless people are. And I don't usually hear a lot of people use the term hobo. It did really fall out of it, but all of a sudden they're starting to say hobo because of iCarly. So I think it's really important that we actually look at this because I feel we need to know as a culture if So I decided to specifically isolate my research to just the U.S.
But I think if you look, I've lived in Vancouver my whole life. I think we will all agree that when they closed the institutions in Vancouver, a similar thing happened, right? Unfortunately, a lot of these people were okay initially because they were given, because we have a better healthcare system here. Hello, Donald, wake up. And they were okay, but I think what started to happen is these people ran out of medication. They didn't, if they were schizophrenic or whatever, they didn't have the ability to even know that they needed to go get their prescription refilled, and as a result, you started to see more and more of them on the street. And they were scary to some people, and I think that also led to this kind of thing that people think, right?
What happened, at least in studying, it's one of the things that led to Reagan's revival of the war on drugs was that a lot of people who were put on the streets and were thought, because of all this liberalist movement in the States at that time, they figured they could just give them the drugs and be able to free them and let them be in peace and not be kept up, so cooped up all the time in these institutions. But after these people were released, and there was a bit of an increase in drug usage because they couldn't get their hands on the prescription stuff. So that might have been why there was this rise in conservatism, because all of a sudden there's this failure in the liberal movement that kind of caused people to kind of change their minds.
What was exactly the failure? But
Well, in this one
I'm not going to argue
case,
with Jacob. No, I'm just kidding. There was the systems weren't set up
yeah.
to accommodate, to help, to these people in the community, these people in the community. But what I was going to say was, I was just wondering about that, because you were looking at representations. And so you're looking at how at one point you had sort of this noble vagabond or traveler or wanderer, right?
Yeah.
And Charlie Chaplin and these other characters. And then you're talking about the sort of stationary. And also the three, so homelessness came to be seen as kind of an urban
Yeah.
phenomenon that was
Yeah.
people were stationary, and then it was linked with mental illness, mental disabilities. So do you see, so if you're looking at the representations, do you think that this representation over here, like with the children talking about sort of it's personal responsibility, it's about, you're mentally ill, you're spent too much money, or what was the other one?
The
You're
other
mentally ill,
one
you
was
spend too much money,
mentally ill, you spend too much money,
you're drugs,
you get high all the time.
So do you think that's a part of the rise of conservatism too, or why do we move from this?
I'm basically just trying to state what happened during the 1970s. Now, I'm not entirely sure why this shift occurred. I can't state at this time why it did. I can say that it did happen after deinstitutionalization and after this rise of conservatism. And I'm not saying that conservatism was wrong in that aspect. I'm simply saying that because of conservatism, there was less freedom of movement after the failure of 1960s counterculture with the hippies, which might have played a part in why there's not this, because you see like examples like On the Road, where Jack Kerouac's traveling around with his friends during the beat movement. He's going to jazz scenes, he's traveling, he's getting work where he can. The Tramp is another example. He's moving around, he's always in different places, he's never just staying on the street. But there's this dramatic shift after that where all of a sudden these portrayals are of very stationary people. They don't move around, they stay in one place, and it's usually just on the street.
I'm interested to know how you selected the literature and films and TV shows that you did.
Essentially, what I tried to do was I tried as quickly as possible, because I didn't really have the luxury of time too much. But I looked into a lot of websites and a little bit of previous research on homeless portrayals. There's actually a website called tvtropes.org that goes through a lot of tropes just specifically of TV. And they have a lot of ones that are actually specifically relegated to homeless people. They have homeless hero, crazy homeless people. The Ophelia is also sort of an example where that's a woman who is seen as a little bit mentally unwell, but she may be prophetic. Then there's also the homeless person with a bird companion. So there's all these different tropes in media, and I looked at the best examples that I could find, and I just kind of decided I wanted to analyze the most popular ones at that time, the ones that were the biggest. Like Ironweed won a Pulitzer Prize in 1984. So it garnered a lot of attention at the time. It actually was adapted into a movie. starring Jakob and Meryl Streep, who were two of the biggest stars at that time as well. So I wanted to look at basically the best examples that were most likely to have been seen by a lot of people. And hopefully, because they were seen by a lot of people, they reflect a large acceptance of that portrayal of what a homeless person is.
In your research, either at the time or since, have you come across contemporary portrayals of homelessness that seem more fitting or more, I don't know, like less critical of homelessness?
Not so much. There's a little bit. There have been a couple of movies that have come out. I think Lady in the Van was one of them, which was I think it was goodness, what's her name? I'm gonna forget. I think she played Professor McGonagall.
Maggie Smith.
Maggie Smith, thank you so much. And she was this homeless lady who lived in a van and was befriended by the person who lived next to them. So there are a couple of examples, but the problem is those are sort of outliers. I find a lot of the portrayals are still kind of shown as this, and there's still this large audience tuning in to see these one-off characters that are portrayed as the butt of the joke instead of who come across the joke or are on, instead of being on an adventure, they are the adventure of someone else.
I just found it because it's so interesting, that first research you talked about where they were looking at the brain.
Yeah.
And so you might be suggesting that those kind of responses are learned, right?
Yeah. I mean,
What do you make of that research?
I'm lucky enough to actually have a friend who's completing his 4th year in neuroscience at Queen's University, and so I talked to him about the specific findings of that research. And what he said was, you can take it with a bit of a grain of salt, because he said even for fMRI studies, it is a bit of a small sample size. But he did happen to know that as the brain is still being studied, all we can say about certain parts of the brain is that we correlate them with certain activities. So like the occipital lobe is thought to be where vision comes from, but we can't say for certain we correlate it with that. So what the specific part of the brain they studied in those scans was called the medial prefrontal cortex, which is correlated with social cognition, which is a psychological concept where it's responsible for recognizing human beings. It's activated when you interact with a human being. And what they actually noticed was that part of the brain did not activate with extreme out groups, that is, groups that people are strongly do not identify with, like the homeless or drug addicts. It didn't actually activate, so you could say that there's a possibility they don't recognize them as human. What did actually activate were the amygdala and the amygdala, which is actually correlated with disgust. And like I said, basically there was a control group, and they experimented with the control group was shown images of objects, things that would not activate the medial prefrontal cortex. And the experimental group was shown images of different people. We had rich, middle class, homeless people, drug addicts, and they all had different levels of brain activation, but the one thing that was across the board was that the medial prefrontal cortex was not activated when shown images of drug addicts or homeless people. And instead, the parts of the brain that were correlated with disgust that were activated when the control study saw pictures of vomit and overflowing toilets was activated instead.
Okay, I guess we're time is up. Well, thank you very much, Jake.